Hello and welcome to the debate on Sky News. I'm Niall Paterson. Here's our take on developments brought together from America, the UK and around the world. The global terror threat, the increasing power of ISIS. Ebola has now killed 8,000 people. What's being done to stop the spread? And should the United Nations be more proactive in 2015? We'll be speaking to the Deputy Secretary-General. Ebola, Syria, ISIS, refugees, Israel, Palestine. It's a list that could go on indefinitely, and it's the 2015 to-do list for the United Nations as it approaches its 70th anniversary. Well, in just a moment, Jan Eliasson, the UN's Deputy Secretary-General, will be in the studio. But first, as usual, let's hear from the Democrat commentator Jeffrey Robinson in New York and the Conservative commentator Armstrong Williams joining us from Washington. Jeffrey, let's start with you if we can. There can hardly be a UN Secretary-General, indeed, who wouldn't concede that at times the fortunes of the United Nations have been a little bit scattered, but it does truly remain a force for good in the 21st century.
It certainly remains a force for hope in the 21st century. It does a number of things very, very well that never make any headlines. Things like legislation for maritime law, space law, cleaning up the oceans with pollution, United Nations International Children's Fund, UNICEF, the World Health Organization. A lot of it is wonderful. The headlines, unfortunately, tend to show the slip-ups and where the UN fails and where the UN bogs down. And I don't think they're necessarily fair, but it's a reality of the UN that most people think of it as a committee that's drawing a horse and comes up with a camel. You know that old expression, that is just too big, too bulky, too confused, and doesn't really work.
Well, Armstrong, moving on from Jeffrey's point, given just how often these days we are seeing, individual states operating on their own outside the UN's remit, or even in kind of ad hoc coalitions, I mean, what is the role for a supranational organisation like the United Nations these days?
What Jeffrey said, you cannot really argue with. But, the United Nations, if you think about the main purpose, is to resolve issues between countries through diplomacy before these countries resort to military force and before conflicts escalate. And so the problem, unfortunately, if you look at the entire history of the United Nations, it has consistently failed this goal and will continue being unless, and there are factors that have caused this through really no fault of their own. It's just how they're organized. The United Nations is primarily a forum for debate. And as a result, it is an international organization where countries send representatives to argue for or against issues. And the other thing that you just mentioned about, many of these countries of the United Nations, in the first place, they're just not for peace. These nations have very questionable voting practices, and the only possible solution, and I know Jeffrey's going to think that this is radical, is to sort of deny voting rights for non-peace-loving nations, and this includes any non-free and non-democratic country who would be biased towards dictators and regimes. And so I just think the United Nations, especially when you have 5 nations that can veto any resolution that the majority of the United Nations members agree upon, the structure, the way it's organized and set up, they cannot work and they cannot be a force for good when it comes to these kinds of issues. Something has to change.
Well, let's now speak with the Deputy General Secretary of the United Nations, Jan Eliasson, in our New York studios for us today. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Eliasson. Let's start with one of those topics on which the United Nations perhaps might have made more progress, and indeed one of those issues which really is at top of the agenda for individual governments, that of global terror. What is the United Nations' role in combating the rise of organisations such as ISIS?
Well, I think we all have an obligation to do everything we can to stop this plague of terrorism. It has to do with dealing with the acute situations like ISIL in Iraq and Boko Haram in cooperation with the government concerned. But also we need to look at the deeper causes of these phenomena. And that's why we should recall that the United Nations is not only responsible for working for peace and security, but also for development and respect of human rights. So I think what we need to look at in today's world is to see the power of working at the same time with issues related to peace, development and human rights. And this requires action from us in the United Nations, but also from member states and other stakeholders in the international system.
There are clearly overarching aims, long-term goals for the United Nations, but at times it does feel as if the UN can't act as quickly as it might. Let's take, for example, Syria, where ISIS now has a more than just a foothold. The United Nations mission left there in 2012, and arguably the situation hasn't improved since then.
You're right. Of course, we should remind ourselves that the chemical weapons were destroyed and taken away with action through the United Nations. But I regret very deeply that we don't have a strong enough Security Council resolution for our work in Syria. Both Kofi Annan and Lakhdar Brahimi, great negotiators, came to the conclusion that they didn't have enough muscle to do the job. So what we have to do is deal with a very, very serious humanitarian situation, which is just enormously damaging to the countries in the region. I just came back from Lebanon, 1.5 million refugees in a population of 4.5. Every third inhabitant in Lebanon is a refugee. And we are there and try to save lives both inside Syria and in the region.
It is at times difficult to see that the United Nations is making much progress in terms of its primary objective, the idea that it is to combat the scourge of war. But this year, for example, we have seen record numbers of peacekeepers out there, 130,000 of them on the ground, tackling problems which other governments wish not to involve themselves with.
Yeah, that's the thing. Well, I would like to ask Mr. Eliasson something that it directly concerns this. We see a public face of the United Nations in the Security Council and the General Assembly, and it's televised, and resolutions come up, nations sign them and then ignore them, basically ignore them. And there's time and time again, I mean, I can cite a dozen cases where things have simply been ratified and then completely ignored at home. But I'm interested in the whole idea of back chat. You've got the building on the East River, and every diplomat there has access to every other diplomat there. Mr. Eliasson, how much back chat goes on, private meetings between players who might not necessarily want to be seen in public? How much of that happens, and has any of it ever proved useful?
Well, a lot of such contacts takes place. I have been working many years in the UN, and I would say the discussions in the corridors, the informal contacts, United Nations as a meeting place is a function which is not sufficiently known and sufficiently used, but and understood. I think we should also remember that we can conduct quiet diplomacy and try to reach solutions without headlines and under the radar. Understandably, I cannot now describe such situations, but I can tell you that every day we have some type of contact of this nature under the radar, discrete channels, talking to key actors in conflict areas to try to reduce the level of violence and, above all, to prevent crisis. We have instituted now a system of looking at human rights violations as the first sign of possible mass atrocities. So we now have something we call human rights up front, where we act on the early stages of human rights violations rather than waiting for mass atrocities. That requires also a number of quiet contacts in the situations which are of this nature. So I'm glad you pointed to this. I think we should not forget that.
Armstrong, there is perhaps an understandable focus on the fact that the Security Council is sometimes stymied by that veto possessed by the 5 permanent members. But as Mr. Eliasson was elaborating on there, it is what happens elsewhere within the United Nations, in the margins, in those back rooms, the discussions that take place that simply doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. There is no other organisation that could facilitate those discussions.
Well, listen, in all fairness, these countries have this power because they were the founding members of the United Nations that wrote the rules of the UN after World War II. But unfortunately, this non-democracy fails for several reasons. First, only a true democracy among nations is unbiased and fair. And thus, the complete structure of this organization needs a major overhaul. And this, too, is not likely to happen since the countries with vetoing power are unlikely to unanimously agree, and you can understand, to give up the right for fairness' sake. But I want to mention something to the honorable guest, and that is when you talk to him about this issue of terrorism. You know, I didn't get into this in my when we talked initially about why the United Nations continues to be a failure in many ways, is because it's useless, and I emphasize the word useless when it comes to terrorism. The United Nations does not even formally recognize any country as a terrorist state, not even recognize them. And furthermore, terrorists are not interested in the politics of debating in a public forum such as the United Nations. I mean, listen, to discuss and work out their issues. And so what happens? The United Nations does not get involved in politics with terrorist groups, and as a result, it is completely blinded to terrorist groups, has no plans to address terrorism, and has no intentions of changing. And so when you ask them that question, the fact is that the United States, as the largest international organization that promotes peace, is completely unable, and no offense, Mr. Deputy, you're unable to address terrorism because it is further proof that you're ineffective because you don't even recognize these bloody terrorists as terrorist states. So how can you even begin to help resolve these issues if you can't even acknowledge that terrorism exists in these states?
Well, I think that is a bit exaggerated because we certainly have a counter-terrorism strategy adopted by the General Assembly, and the Security Council has a committee which deals with terrorism, and we have sanctions against terrorist groups, and we are, of course, fully implementing this. And we work with member states. I can't say that we are working. I just came back from Iraq. I came back from Nigeria. I have been talking with my colleagues about the Boko Haram and the ISIL, and we are working on a strategy on how to diminish their role, how to expand the credibility of the government in the case of Iraq, for instance, so that the different Sunni groups stand behind the government rather than supporting ISIL in the north. We are doing work on this all the time. I can't work with the Syria or Iraq situation without dealing with terrorism.
Mr. Eliasson, let's move on to a topic on which the UN has latterly made some progress. Ebola, the outbreak in West Africa, which has led to the deaths of some 8,000 people. What is your appraisal of the way in which the United Nations has reacted and subsequently developed its response to Ebola?
There is a huge effort going on, and we are mobilizing the whole UN system. We are getting tremendous help from countries ranging from the United States to China to Cuba to the African countries. We are seeing difference on the ground, particularly in Liberia. We have seeing more problems in Sierra Leone and Guinea, but I think we are moving in the right direction. We, of course, have learned one thing already, and that goes for not only health crisis, but also for humanitarian crisis and for development crisis, and that is we have to act as early as possible. The sooner you get into a problem area in all these areas, the better. We are doing our absolutely best, and we promise the people of Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea that we will be on their side, not only at this stage, but also in the recovery stage. We are talking about countries who have very, very poor systems of healthcare, and we need to help them be better prepared for such pandemics in the future.
Some people might be surprised by the fact that this was the first ever UN emergency health mission. I mean, is there now an argument that there should be a health equivalent of the peacekeeping mission which has proved successful in other parts of the world? I see Jeffrey nodding his head there, but Deputy Secretary General, we'll ask for your response first.
Well, I think you are absolutely right. We are working right now, WHO and others, on a emergency response facility and a possibility to act immediately, and we hope that the WHO will go in that direction. We definitely have to have an equivalent of what we have in the humanitarian response, an area which I worked with very much myself, where we almost have automatic reactions in situations at the earliest stages. And this is certainly the realization of the leadership of WHO, but also of the leadership of the United Nations. So we hope that we will have the support of member states to have such a facility. And that is one of the lessons learned from the Ebola crisis.
Jeffrey.
Why is it, Mr. Eliasson, why has it taken so long? Disasters and crises are nothing new to the United Nations, whether it be refugee crises or earthquakes like Haiti or Ebola or any number of things that have happened in the last 70 years. Why doesn't the United Nations establish a peacekeeping disaster force that can bring in medicine, that can bring in doctors, that can bring in relief workers, that can really react immediately? What would it take to institute such a force?
I think we are on the way of creating a facility of a similar nature, but you should not forget that we should also have a better facility, better possibilities for the countries themselves to act early on. To always think that it is someone come flying in from the outside to solve the problems is sometimes necessary when you have situations where things are getting out of the control. But I think what we need to know is that we have that preparedness together with the countries that are less privileged. You know, the Ebola, if it had to been striking United States or Europe, we would probably have a mortality rate of 20–25%. But in these three countries, you have had 60 to 75% mortality, mainly reflecting the fact that we have such poor health systems. So we have to do a combination of having massive reactions when needed in critical situations, but also understand that we have to build up national capacity.
Armstrong, the WHO, the World Health Organization, might have been better placed to respond to the Ebola crisis if the United States and others hadn't cut their funding to the WHO.
Well, the United States cuts its funding because the United Nations is not necessarily a popular organization in the United States, and not only just resistance against its everyday citizens, but also members of Congress and who are in very powerful positions who control those purse strings. But I don't want to just totally not recognize and embrace the Deputy Secretary General on something he said with the issue of Ebola, because the UN mission for Ebola emergency response is the first ever UN emergency health mission. And while we may talk about that others could have stepped in, they do a very good job with these safe and dignified barriers. They do a very good job with the social mobilization, managing these cases, finding contacts and tracing people. And sometimes, you know, that human touch is important. While you may not have saved as many people as you wanted to save, the UN does a very good job with the human touch, with the compassion, and making people feel that and believe that they care, and showing them how they can empower themselves and help them better organize, because they go into some situations that we don't even have the capability or the capacity to realize that people can live in these kind of conditions. So I think kudos really go to the United Nations when it comes to their health response and what they were able to put in place. It can always be better, but I think it's also important to recognize when they also do a good job, a job that could not be done if they were not there, and many people would suffer even more if their presence was not felt in that region.
Well, I'm glad that you pointed to what we do out there in the field. I am basically a field person. I was responsible for humanitarian affairs in the world earlier, and now I go out to all these crisis areas and I see my colleagues. I see them working under tremendously difficult circumstances. We have lost hundreds and hundreds of peacekeepers, of humanitarian workers, of health personnel in our missions. The world is getting more and more dangerous. United Nations isn't always seen as a neutral force. We are sometimes taking stand against terrorists, apropos what we just discussed. And I just want always to recall, particularly to the American public, which reflecting this skepticism that we just talked about, haven't seen what we do out there in the field. We have in today's world over 50 million people, refugees or displaced people, and we are taking care of practically all of them, not as well as we should, because we have problems with funding. And we are out there to vaccinate children. We are there to give education, and we do so much out there in the field. I wish that the skeptics of the UN would see the work out in the field and to see the sacrifices that we are making to do that. And we always try to put in front of us every day the three first words of the Charter: we the peoples. It is to the peoples we want to deliver peace, development and human rights. And I'm grateful that you brought up this field perspective.
Mr. Eliasson, isn't perhaps part of the problem that the United Nations itself, although it has expanded, we have a number of autonomous agencies now, we have a number of funds, numerous other connected organisations, that actually at its core, the United Nations hasn't, since its inception, changed structurally, despite the fact that compared to where we started, in terms of member states, we're over 3 times as large?
Well, the UN Charter is still a beautiful document, and the organization is basically a fully democratic organization, one nation, one vote. Except, of course, in the Security Council, where you have 5 nations who have the veto right. And that was the insurance at the time of the creation of the United Nations, that the major powers would take the United Nations seriously. It was a bit of a sacrifice to maintain that function. And I would hope that those who have those veto powers would use it with responsibility, in other words, as seldom as possible, because they have an obligation to stand up for international peace and security. I think we need to reform, and I think the most important direction we have to go, apropos the earlier discussion, that is to act early. We have to act early at the first vibration of a conflict. We have to act early when we see a disease appearing, when we see in the human rights area, children can't go to school because of their ethnic background or religious grouping. Then we have to get in there. And I think if we move this spectrum, this attention to the early part of the conflicts, early part of negative developments, then we have made a quality step forward. And then we must understand United Nations will be as strong as the member states want it to be. And I think that we should understand the United Nations cannot do it alone. We need the help of governments, we need the help of civil society, we need the help of the academic institutions, we need the help of individuals. If we really work through the United Nations and realize that this work is in our national interest, then I think we can achieve a bit, go some steps forward this crucial year. We will this year both have a decision on the Sustainable Development Goals for the next 15 years, and we will have a decision in Paris on the climate change measures. These are historic measures, and I hope the member states now feel solidarity with the people and put their situation in the front and come to good conclusions on these 2 major negotiations.
Armstrong, there can't be many people who look at the job of Secretary General with envy. I mean, as Mr. Eliasson was alluding to there, it is essentially a huge job, but with close to 200 bosses. Are we at the point now of saying that we need to bring in a Secretary General from outside the system, the likes of a Tony Blair-style figure with real clout, or dare I even say it, a President Obama?
Sometimes I think when we bring in these former heads of states, I notice that even former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was touted as someone that could head an organization of similarity. But you're bringing these people in because they were heads of states and they've run countries. Sometimes you need people who have really been in the trenches, who've been on the ground, who spent years and decades understanding exactly what is needed, exactly what needs to change, and where you can be most effective. And sometimes you want to bring in these high-powered figures because it brings in money, it brings in publicity, it brings in stature, but it doesn't necessarily empower and make the difference in the lives of the people where they are. And I think what the Deputy Secretary General is saying about what they do in the field, and it is true that many UN forces are considered as terrorists and not friendly, and they put their lives on the line. Some of them die from Ebola. Some of them die in the most crazy and unimaginative situations. And I think what you need is leadership that works, not cosmetic, not someone that we all recognize as a world figure, but somebody that the people recognize that can get their hands dirty, can go in and get the job done. Sometimes you need just an everyday person to take that position and move this organization forward.
Mr. Eliasson, a final question to you in this, the year of the UN's 70th anniversary. Is it the UN's greatest achievement that they can say, look, the world would have been far worse without us? Indeed, can the UN actually ever hope to achieve any more than that?
I think the world would have been in much worse shape without the United Nations. Not only are we setting the norms and the values and the principles that we would like to see guide the world, principles that we need to be reminded of in today's world every minute, because the horrors are there in war and atrocities and violations of human rights and extreme poverty and inequalities. So we stand for the world that we want to see. And then the second question is, how much do we want to use this tool? How much want to use this machinery? And then we must understand that if we do that, we actually serve our own nation's interests. Maybe 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago, that wasn't the case. You could say the national interest is there and the international is there. But in today's world, they come together. You cannot divide up home and outside. It's coming together. You see it all over the world. The world exists inside our countries, and we exist in the world. And of course, we need to do better, and we must do acting early. This, I think, as I come back again, is the main thing to remember. And the United Nations is there to serve. And I just say, if we can just have more of political will helping us move forward, I think we can improve conditions in the world, and we need to do so.
Deputy Secretary-General Jan Eliasson, thanks very much for your time. And as always, Jeffrey and Armstrong, good to see you. Well, that's it for this edition of The Debate. Until next time, goodbye.